Whether you're reading the pages of Tolkien's epic fantasy or watching Peter Jackson's own interpretation of the world, Middle-earth is a place depicted in such meticulous detail that you can practically smell its air, feel its walls, and taste its food. It's a world that enraptures and envelops you. From the Shire to Mordor, every corner of it is so well realized, rich in its own style and history, that it can be easy to forget that none of it is actually real. But there is an event that ties the real world to Middle-earth's fantasy land of wizards, dwarves, elves, and men.
A battlefield where 3 million soldiers fought, and 1 million lost their lives amidst scorched ruins. The Battle of the Somme.
Among the soldiers who trudged through its trenches was one John Ronald Reuel, or J.R.R. Tolkien.
The events of The Lord of the Rings might not be an allegory for the First World War, but its fantasy landscape is full of the ghosts of no man's land.
The First World War, one of the deadliest conflicts in history, and yet a time of remarkable industrial innovation, where new forms of warfare were introduced both on land and in the sky. It was the first time tanks and planes were used in battle, alongside machine guns, artillery shells, poison gas, and flamethrowers, all of which were mass-produced via factory assembly lines.
To J.R.R. Tolkien, this feat in industrial innovation was neither to be celebrated nor embraced. To him, it was a symptom of power in the wrong hands, a theme that would serve as the nuts and bolts for evil in Middle-earth.
But even before the war, Tolkien favored the natural world over a manufactured one. While growing up in Sarehole in Birmingham, England, he watched as smokestacks began to obscure the idyllic British countryside he grew up with, polluting it with grim factories of industrialization.
Much like that of a Hobbit, one of the peoples of Middle-earth, the joys of Tolkien's life were simple. He liked trees, good food, tobacco, and beer.
He felt industrialism was a tyranny over man and nature, motivated by greed and laziness, and referred to factory work as slavery hidden out of sight behind walls. He wrote in a letter to his son Christopher, "Labor-saving machinery only creates endless and worse labor."
But despite his contempt for industry and the coercion of man, when the First World War started in 1914, Tolkien enlisted in the British Army.
However, his enlistment in the military was delayed until completing his degree at Oxford University, which he did so in 1915, graduating with first-class honors. In March 1916, Tolkien married Edith Bratt, who he had known and loved since 1909. After a few short months of marriage, he was deployed to France and into the trenches of the Somme. Junior officers were being killed off, a dozen a minute. Parting from my wife then, it was like death.
The 141-day battle was the largest of World War I, and is documented as one of the bloodiest in human history. The British forces suffered 60,000 casualties on the first day alone.
The toll of war was never more evident to him than when he took part in an attack on Ovillers-la-Boisselle, a hilltop village which the Germans had turned into a trench fortress. The aftermath of the battle was vividly documented in John Garth's book, Tolkien and the Great War. It was on the approach to Ovillers that Tolkien first encountered the lost of the Somme. Heralded by their stench, darkly hunched or prone, or hanging on the wire until a stab of brightness revealed them, the bloated and putrescent dead.
Among Tolkien's battalion alone, from about 800 soldiers, 600 of them were lost at Ovillers, and he very well may have been a part of the body count too, if he hadn't fallen ill.
On October 25, 1916, Tolkien was diagnosed with trench fever, a common illness among soldiers. Just days after his battalion's final push for the Somme, he was hospitalized with a fever of 103.
His time bedridden was a turning point for his imagination and the creation of his make-believe world.
Tolkien's time in hospital in the First World War was really important, above all for practical reasons, that it gave him time to think and to write. And Tolkien reacted really strangely to boredom. So you can imagine he was pretty bored in hospital, but it could awaken his imagination.
He spent his time refining fictional languages that would soon underpin the fantasy world that he had begun working on years before the war commenced.
It seemed as though the framework of Tolkien's world came into existence rapidly, emerging from his mind, as he wrote, almost fully formed.
These were the seeds that would soon become the fall of Gondolin, a dark story depicting the destruction of an elven civilization at the hands of creatures Tolkien describes like machines.
Dragons and beasts that roll over obstacles by reason of the exceeding heaviness of their bodies. blast with fire, and open up to unleash troops hidden inside. Straight out of the Somme, this extensive writing period was a way for Tolkien to contextualize and express his own thoughts and feelings on the war.
I think it was cathartic for him. I think it helped him to express feelings. He said so himself. I created this in order to express my feelings about fair and foul, good and evil. What he was doing was finding the keynotes of his times. So one of them was mechanisation, industrialisation. Another one was militarism. And he saw the two knitted together. He watched as young men, in all their frailty, stood up and marched out against machine guns and artillery shells, man against machine. He saw creative genius cut down in that way. So he created a world in which he has representatives of beauty and truth and craft and art, particularly the elves, and their opponents, the orcs, and so forth, who are representatives of a blind militarism.
At the end of the war, Tolkien set up home with Edith and launched his career in English language and literature, becoming a professor at the University of Leeds, and then from 1925 onwards at Oxford.
It was while at Oxford that he would spend his free time writing a fantasy tale for his children about an unsuspecting hero who would journey far from his home alongside dwarves and a wizard, encountering dangers like goblins, trolls, and a dragon. That story is, of course, The Hobbit. In 1936, it caught the eyes of publisher Allen and Unwin, and within a year it was published. It was met with acclaim from both adults and children, and left publishers demanding a sequel.
It wouldn't be until 1954, 17 years after The Hobbit, and 36 years after the end of the First World War, that The Lord of the Rings would be published. And just like the war changed the world completely, it made a grave impact on the landscape of Tolkien's fantasy world.
The First World War had both a broad and specific impact on Tolkien's writing. Most specific case, I suppose, is in The Lord of the Rings when Frodo and Sam the Hobbits are being guided through the dead marshes by Gollum, and they look into pools of water and see dead faces. The dead faces are there from some ancient battle. In terms of the scene, this is precisely what one would see on the battlefield during the autumn of 1916 when the shell holes flooded because of heavy rains and soldiers had been left out in no man's land to die. And it was a searing experience that Tolkien and fellow soldiers never forgot.
The Somme battlefield became a flattened, mangled stretch of land polluted with the remnants of man-made machines of destruction. Aside from the Somme, other similarities can be drawn to the Ringwraiths, or the Nazgul, Sauron's most dreaded and powerful servants, who were once men but were so corrupted by the power of the rings that Sauron gave them that they became twisted wraiths.
When you look at Tolkien's writings in the First World War in detail, you can be struck by all kinds of really curious comparisons. One of the most interesting I found is between the Ringwraiths, the Nazgul, and artillery shells, the sound of artillery shells. In the Shire, when the Hobbits first encounter the Black Riders, they hear this piercing scream. Later on, after Frodo's been stabbed by one of their knives, he goes into a kind of fever experience, the kind of thing that Tolkien had experienced. And in that fever, he dreams that he's being hunted through the hills by winged pursuers above him, and he can hear the flapping of the wings. Strangely enough, if you read the descriptions of what artillery shells sounded like when you were in the trenches, the sound of wings and screaming. Some of the shells, as they turned over in the air, they would make this whoomph, whoomph, whoomph noise. And then falling straight, they would just scream piercingly. So I think that these terrors are kind of knitted into a completely mythological, gothic effect that Tolkien wanted to use in The Lord of the Rings.
And like the men corrupted and transformed into Nazgul, orcs were once elves. Orcs are depicted as brutalized workers, slaving out of sight in the caverns of Isengard, ripping trees from their roots, mass-producing crude weapons and suits of armor, and barbarically breeding more soldiers, while under the control of the powerful wizard Saruman.
In depicting evil within his dense fantasy universe, Tolkien drew inspiration from the impact the iron fist of industrialization was having on the world around him, and in the same way, looked to his own life and experiences to find the good in his world. the Hobbits.
Middle-earth's most iconic people, and quite possibly the most unobtrusive, serve as a counterbalance. They love peace and quiet, and rarely travel far from their homeland of the Shire, nor do they want to.
If I take one more step, it'll be the farthest away from home I've ever been.
A palpable similarity to Tolkien's own initial reluctance to volunteer for the British Army at the start of the First World War. It's no wonder that hobbits are a prominent focal point in his stories, as they represent people he has a great deal of appreciation for, good common English folk. Hobbits are English people who are people coping in a world which in a sense is far too big for them, and yet they grow into it.
The affinity came from his close experience fighting alongside the ordinary working man during World War I, as well as sympathy for the agricultural workers that tilled the fields near his childhood home of Sarehole. And few characters better encapsulate Tolkien's feelings towards the honorable common man than Samwise Gamgee, Frodo Baggins' best friend and loyal companion who aids him on the journey to destroy the One Ring.
Characterized as a simple hobbit, a gardener by trade, Sam is an admirer of great wonders and someone captivated by tales of adventure. The relationship between Frodo and Sam is most comparable to Tolkien's experiences with his fellow soldiers in World War I, specifically Batmen, lower-ranked privates that would fulfill domestic chores and duties for higher-ranked officers. Tolkien, who was positioned with a higher ranking due to his prior training and education, empathized deeply with Batmen who he disliked bossing around. The most improper job of any man is bossing other men. Not one in a million is fit for it, and least of all those who seek the opportunity. Tolkien's sentiment for soldiers and Batmen was immortalized in Sam's character, who is often considered the true hero of The Lord of the Rings, having been the one to repeatedly save Frodo along the journey, and iconically carry him to Mount Doom to destroy the One Ring once and for all. Later in life, in a letter to his son Christopher, he said, "My Sam Gamgee is indeed a reflection of the English soldier, of the privates and Batmen I knew in the 1914 war, and recognize as so far superior to myself."
After the ring is destroyed, Frodo is plagued with terrifying flashbacks, nightmares, and crippling anxiety as a result of everything he and his friends endured during their journey.
Frodo suffers effectively psychological trauma. He's sleepless, he shivers and quakes, he sees daytime visions, he's disconnected from all the memories that can bring him comfort. These are precisely the kinds of symptoms that would be seen in victims of shell shock, as post-traumatic stress disorder was known during the First World War. And Sam is their practical man, patient, loyal, heroic in his own way, giving him the kind of support that an officer servant would give his officer.
Frodo had given up everything in order to bring peace to the land he loved, and in doing so, lost himself along the way. There is no real going back. Though I may come to the Shire, it will not seem the same, for I shall not be the same. I'm wounded with knife, sting, and tooth, and a long burden. In the end, Frodo chooses to leave the Shire for good and go to the Undying Lands, an earthly paradise west of the shores of Middle-earth, to seek healing from the immortal elves who live there.
A soldier may come home and be physically healed, but the trauma of war may be impossible to leave behind. Frodo's journey west for healing is a fairy tale ending, but implies that in reality, the only true healing is after death. Still, given everything we've discussed, Tolkien has been adamant to denounce the allegorizing of his work. As bluntly stated in one of his letters,
To ask if the orcs are communists is to me as sensible as asking if communists are orcs.
The problem is, we need to understand what Tolkien meant by allegory. He gave an example. He gave that kind of example where a book can be read as a sort of code. He said, I believe in applicability, not allegory. So an allegory is something where the author has attempted to impose a certain reading. And if you don't see that reading, you're failing to read the book correctly. Applicability means that the reader is free to make his or her own interpretation. Enjoy the book at whatever the level they choose. Objection to allegory does not mean that Tolkien himself did not see applicability. He just didn't want to ram it down your throat. He was a man of his times. He was a man, like any great artist, turning experience into something that would resonate beyond his times.
Tolkien was open to his work being interpreted, and while The Lord of the Rings might not be a cut and dry allegory for the First World War, it seems nearly impossible not to draw comparisons from Tolkien's truth to the fiction he created. Thank you so much for watching this episode of True Fiction. There was a lot to learn between Lord of the Rings and Tolkien's life, but pronouncing half the stuff in this episode was, well, humbling. In next week's episode, we're looking at social isolation in Stanley Kubrick's The Shining, so come back here to GameSpot Universe to check it out.